In a dining room thick with the scent of expensive wine and unspoken threats, Saad Williams was just a face in the crowd, until her hands moved in a secret language that would change a mafia boss's empire forever. Working the VIP floor of Seoul's most elite fusion restaurant, Saad kept her head down and her brilliance hidden behind a crisp black and white uniform. She was a linguistics prodigy forced into the shadows by a past she couldn't outrun, seeking only the safety of a steady paycheck and total anonymity. But as the restaurant fell into a terrifying bone-chilling silence, she realized that tonight, invisible was no longer an option. Not when the city's most feared man walked in with a daughter who was drowning in a silence of her own. Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The following evening, the restaurant felt different. The air was no longer thick with the usual perfume of expensive truffles and aged whiskey. Instead, it felt charged, as if a storm were held in a glass jar. Saad smoothed the front of her apron, her fingers twitching instinctively. She had spent the last 24 hours replaying the moment her hands had spoken for her. The way Yumi's eyes had widened, the way the girl's silver hair had shimmered as she nodded in frantic, joyful recognition. Saad had broken the golden rule of service. She had become a person. And in this world, being a person to a man like Han Juntae was a dangerous thing. The double mahogany doors swung open, but there was no entourage this time. No heavy-set men with earpieces, no silent daughter. There was only Juntae. He moved with a predatory grace, his black suit absorbing the ambient light of the crystal chandeliers. He didn't wait for the maitre d' to greet him. He walked straight toward the section where Saad stood, his eyes locked onto hers with a cold, assessing intensity that made the oxygen in her lungs feel thin. He took a seat at a secluded corner table, but he didn't reach for the leather-bound menu. He didn't even look at the wine list. When Saad approached, her pulse hammering against her throat like a trapped bird, he didn't give her the chance to recite the evening's specials. "Saad Williams," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of a command. She froze. "Sir, I don't care about the food," he said, leaning forward. The tattoos on his hands, dark, intricate ink that disappeared beneath his cuffs, caught the light. "And I don't care about the service. I want to know where a server in a place like this learns a dialect of sign language that has been extinct in the public sector for 20 years. Saad tightened her grip on her notepad. She could feel the stares of the other staff members, a collective held breath. "I was a linguistics major, Mr. Han. I have a passion for regional dialects." "You have a gift for more than just dialects," Juntae countered. His eyes lowered, scanning her as if reading a ledger of her secrets. "My daughter hasn't smiled in 3 years. She hasn't engaged with a single tutor, a single therapist, or a single specialist I've paid to help her. Yet last night, you gave her a name for the flowers on the table, and she hasn't stopped signing it since." There was a flicker of something in his expression, not quite softness but a fierce protective ache that surprised her. It was the look of a man who owned the city but couldn't buy a conversation with his own child. "She's lonely, sir," Saad said softly, the words slipping out before her survival instinct could catch them. "Silence is a very large room to live in by yourself." Juntae went still. The silence between them stretched, heavy and profound. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope, sliding it across the tablecloth toward her. "My daughter is being suffocated by people who speak at her, not to her," he said. "She needs a bridge. You are that bridge." Saad looked down at the envelope. "I have a job here, Mr. Han. I have responsibilities." "You had a job here," he corrected, his tone shifting back to the ironclad authority of a man used to being obeyed. "As of 10 minutes ago, I've settled your contract with the owner. This envelope contains a salary that tripled what you would earn here in a decade. You will move into the estate. You will be her companion, her translator and her shadow. You will teach her the world, and you will teach me how to hear her." Saad felt the walls closing in. This wasn't a job offer, it was a draft. To step into his world was to leave the safety of the shadows she had spent years building. But then she remembered Yumi's face, the elderly woman's spirit trapped in a world of misunderstood gestures, her eyes pleading for a connection. And if I say no? Saad whispered. Juntae stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the table. He leaned in close, the scent of sandalwood and cold steel clinging to him. You're a woman with a very impressive academic record, and a very sudden disappearance from the professional world, Saad. I imagine there are people from your past who would love to know exactly which restaurant you've been hiding in. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. He knew. He had seen through the uniform to the genius underneath, and he was offering her the only thing more valuable than money, a different kind of protection. I'm not a bodyguard, she said, her voice steadier now. I have plenty of those, Juntae said, turning toward the door. I need someone who can see what I'm blind to. My car will be outside at dawn. Don't make it wait. He walked away without looking back, leaving Saad standing in the center of the glittering room, the heavy envelope in her hand feeling like a key to a beautiful, terrifying new cage. The sunrise over Seoul was a bruised purple when the black sedan pulled up to the Han estate. Saad sat in the back, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her modest leather bag. She had expected a fortress. Instead, she found a masterpiece of glass and gray stone perched on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the city like an observant god. As the gates hissed shut behind them, Saad felt a cold shiver of finality. She was no longer a waitress. She was a guest of a man who didn't take no for an answer. The interior of the house was a cathedral of silence. Polished marble floors reflected the minimalist art on the walls, and the staff moved like ghosts, efficient, silent, and entirely devoid of expression. A stern woman in a charcoal suit, who introduced herself only as Mrs. Kong, led Saad through a labyrinth of corridors to a sun-drenched conservatory at the back of the house. The girl is inside, Mrs. Kong said, her voice like dry parchment. She is difficult. Do not be surprised if she ignores you. And do not interfere with Mr. Choi's methods. Saad entered the room and stopped. Yumi was sitting at a heavy oak table, her silver hair catching the morning light. Across from her sat a middle-aged man with thin spectacles and a face that radiated a forced, oily patience. This was Mr. Choi. He was signing to Yumi, but as Saad watched his hands, her blood began to simmer. His movements were clumsy but intentionally so. He was using a simplified, baby version of signs, the linguistic equivalent of shouting slowly at someone who speaks a different language. Stupid, Choi signed, his face twisted into a patronizing smile. Yumi is slow today. Eat your bread. Don't be a burden to father. Yumi's face was a mask of gray exhaustion. She didn't look like the woman who had lit up at the restaurant. She looked defeated, her shoulders hunched as she stared at the crumbs on her plate. She tried to sign back, a complex, rapid movement indicating she wasn't hungry, but Choi caught her wrist mid-air, forcing her hand down onto the table. No, no, Choi said aloud, his voice loud enough for the room to echo, though Yumi couldn't hear him. We use our big signs, Yumi. Don't be difficult. Saad realized in a sickening flash what was happening. Choi wasn't just a bad teacher. He was a jailer. By limiting Yumi's vocabulary and telling her she was slow, he was ensuring she remained isolated and dependent. He was gaslighting a woman who had no way to scream for help. Saad stepped forward, the heels of her boots clicking sharply on the marble. Choi looked up, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. You must be the new companion, he sneered, his gaze sweeping over Saada's simple dress with a dismissive flick. I am in the middle of a lesson. You can wait in the hall. Saad didn't look at him. She looked at Yumi. The elderly woman's eyes met hers, and for a second, a spark of recognition flickered in that dull gaze. Saad didn't hesitate. She lifted her hands, her fingers moving with the fluid, rhythmic elegance of a master. He is lying to you, Saad signed, her movements sharp and undeniable. Your mind is a palace, Yumi. I see the keys in your hands. Do not let him lock the doors. Choi stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. What are you doing? I told you she doesn't understand complex syntax. You'll confuse her. She isn't confused, Mr. Choi, Saad said, her voice calm but vibrating with a quiet, dangerous authority. She's bored. And she's insulted. You've been telling her she's a burden, haven't you? Choi's face went pale, then a mottled, ugly red. I am the head tutor of this household. I have been with the Han family for 5 years. Then for 5 years you have been a thief, Sod interrupted. She walked to the table and placed her hand gently near Yumi's. She didn't touch her. She waited for permission. Yumi reached out, her trembling fingers brushing Sod's skin like she was touching a lifeline. In that moment Sod saw it, the flicker of terror in Yumi's eyes as she glanced toward the door where Mrs. Kong stood watching. This wasn't just a matter of a bad teacher. There was a conspiracy of silence in this house, and the loyal staff were the ones holding the door shut. Yumi's hands moved suddenly, a tiny hidden gesture beneath the edge of the table, meant only for Sod to see. It was a single sign: shadows. Sod felt the weight of the gilded cage settling around her. She wasn't just here to teach, she was here to witness a crime. And if Choi and the others realized she could truly hear what Yumi was saying, Sod wouldn't just be a threat to their jobs. She would be a threat to their lives. In the dim wood-paneled sanctum of Han Juntae's private study, the air was heavy with the scent of tobacco and old leather. Juntae sat behind a monolithic desk of polished obsidian, his silhouette framed by the sprawling lights of Seoul outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Across from him stood Park, a man whose presence was as sharp and unassuming as a razor blade tucked into a silk sleeve. Park placed a manila folder on the desk. It was thin, but the weight of the information inside seemed to press down on the room. The girl is an anomaly, Park said, his voice a steady drone. She isn't just a linguistics major from a local university. Her real name is Sod Williams, but her academic trail goes much deeper. She was a doctoral candidate at Oxford by 22, specialized in cryptolinguistics and extinct syntax. She's fluent in 7 languages and proficient in over a dozen signing systems. Juntae didn't move. He stared at the folder, his eyes tracing the tattoos on his own knuckles. A prodigy. So why was she serving steak to mid-level businessmen in a fusion joint? Park flipped the page. Because 6 years ago, she was the lead analyst for the Kim Syndicate's logistics branch. She didn't know she was working for a front at first. When she realized she was translating encoded shipments for human trafficking and narcotics, she didn't just quit. She sabotaged their ledger. She rewrote their routing code so effectively that the Kims lost 40% of their offshore assets in a single night. Juntae leaned forward, a predatory interest finally breaking through his cold mask. She dismantled a rival house with a keyboard and a dictionary. The Kims blacklisted her, Park continued. They couldn't kill her without drawing federal heat they weren't ready for, so they destroyed her. They wiped her credentials, threatened every university she applied to, and made sure no legitimate firm would ever touch her. She's been living in the gray for years, hiding her brain because it's the only way to keep her family safe. Juntae stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city he fought to control. He had hired a companion for his daughter, a bridge to a silent world. But he realized now he had brought something far more potent into his home. Sod Williams wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was a weapon of pure intellect that had been sidelined by the very people he spent his days outmaneuvering. She's been hypervigilant, Juntae murmured, reflecting on the way she had stood her ground in the restaurant. She wasn't afraid of my tattoos or my name. She was afraid of being recognized. Sir, Park said, his tone shifting to a warning. If the Kims find out she's under your roof, they'll see it as a declaration of war. They'll think you're using her to finish what she started 6 years ago. Juntae turned back to the desk, a slow, dangerous smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. They're right to be afraid. But they don't understand. I didn't hire her to fight their war. I hired her to win mine. He thought of the way Sod had looked at Yumi, the quiet authority, the refusal to be intimidated by the tutor's gaslighting. She wasn't just a server and she wasn't just a translator. She was a woman who knew exactly how to navigate the most dangerous silences in the world. Keep the surveillance tight but do not touch her, Juntae commanded. And Park? Find out who in our own house is still on the Kim's payroll. If they've been silencing my daughter to keep me distracted, I want their names before the sun comes up. He picked up the folder, his thumb lingering over a grainy photo of Sod from her university days. Her eyes were bright then, filled with a fire that had been dampened by years of hiding. He felt a strange, unfamiliar pull in his chest, a mix of respect and a dark, possessive need to see that fire return. Saad Williams was a ghost, but in this house she was going to become a legend. Juntae realized that the silent waitress he had plucked from obscurity was perhaps the only person in Seoul who was more dangerous than he was. The following week, the atmosphere within the Han estate grew stifling, like the pressurized air before a deep-sea tremor. Saad spent every hour by Yumi's side, creating a sanctuary of movement in the girl's sun-drenched suite. To the outside world, and to the prying eyes of the security cameras, they were merely practicing basic vocabulary. But beneath the table, hidden by the heavy folds of the tablecloth, a much more dangerous dialogue was taking place. Saad had taught Yumi a shadow dialect, a series of abbreviated, rapid-fire signs that relied on tactile nuance rather than broad gestures. It was a language meant for the dark. One evening, as the moon hung like a silver sickle over the cliffside, Yumi suddenly stopped mid-sign. She froze, her head tilted slightly as if she could feel a vibration in the floorboards that Saad could not. Her eyes, usually soft and inquisitive, sharpened with a primal sort of fear. She reached out and gripped Saada's forearm, her fingers bruisingly tight. "They are coming," Yumi signed, her hands vibrating with a frantic energy. "The shadows. They walk when the great lion sleeps." Saad leaned in, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who, Yumi? Who are the shadows?" Yumi's gaze darted toward the heavy oak door, then back to Saad. Her hands moved in a blurred, desperate sequence. "The man with the glass eyes, Choi. He does not go home at night. He meets them in the stone room below. The men with the blue ink on their necks. Not father's men. The other ones." Saad felt a cold drop of sweat slide down her spine. Blue ink. The mark of the Kim syndicate, the very people who had dismantled her life 6 years ago. If they were inside this house, it wasn't just for a lesson. "What do they say?" Saad signed, her fingers precise and urgent. "They think I am a doll." Yumi signed, a bitter, haunting smile touching her lips. "They talk in front of me because they think my ears are broken, so my brain must be too. They say the lion is getting soft. They say he cares too much for the broken girl. They are going to take the keys to the city, while he is busy looking at me." The realization hit Saad with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a tutor gaslighting a student. It was a strategic blindfold. By keeping Yumi isolated and difficult, Choi was keeping Juntae's focus entirely on his domestic troubles, drawing his eyes away from the shifting loyalties within his own organization. It was a coup hidden in plain sight, built on the assumption that a deaf woman had nothing to contribute to the conversation. "They have a date," Yumi continued, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to finish the thought. "The night of the red moon. The gala. They said the lion will fall, and the girl will be sent to the quiet place." Saad knew what the quiet place meant in the vocabulary of men like the Kims. It wasn't a school or a hospital. It was a grave. Saad pulled Yumi into a fierce, protective embrace. The girl's small frame shook against her. Saad realized then that she was no longer just an observer or a linguist. She was the only person in the world who truly knew what was happening in the heart of the Han Empire. Juntae was being hunted from within his own walls, and the only witness was a woman the world had deemed invisible. As she held Yumi, Saad looked up at the security camera in the corner of the room. Its red light blinked like a steady, mocking heartbeat. She had spent years running from the Kims, hiding in the anonymity of service, but the shadows had found her anyway. She couldn't stay silent anymore. To save the girl, she would have to find a way to tell the lion that his pride was full of hyenas, without alerting the traitors who were currently watching her every move. The invisible waitress was about to become the most dangerous informant in Seoul. The following evening, the mansion was unusually quiet, the heavy silence punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Juntae had returned late, the scent of rain and gunpowder clinging to his wool overcoat. Instead of retiring to his study, he found himself drawn to the library, where Saad was meticulously organizing a series of hand-drawn linguistic charts. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. In the soft glow of the lamp, The sharp edges of her professionalism seemed to soften. She looked less like a server and more like the scholar she had once been. Her brow furrowed in concentration. "You're still awake," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. Saad didn't jump. She had learned to recognize the heavy, purposeful vibration of his footsteps. She turned, offering a small, respectful nod. "Yumi is asleep. I was preparing tomorrow's lesson." Juntae walked into the room, his presence making the vast space feel suddenly cramped. He stopped at the table, looking down at a diagram she had sketched. It showed the intricate placement of fingers for different emotional states. "You spent 6 hours today talking to her," Juntae remarked, his eyes tracing the ink lines. "And yet, when I walk into the room, she looks at the floor. I am the most powerful man in this district. Yet I am a ghost in my own daughter's life." The raw honesty in his voice caught Saad off guard. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his tattooed hands gripped the back of a chair until his knuckles turned white. This wasn't the Mafia boss demanding tribute. This was a father mourning a connection he didn't know how to build. "It's not because you're a ghost, Mr. Han," Saad said gently. "It's because you speak a language of power and weight. Yumi speaks a language of light and movement. You aren't on the same frequency." Juntae looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Then teach me. Show me how to reach her." Saad felt a flutter of apprehension. To teach him was to let him into her space, to bridge the gap between the employer and the employee. But as she looked at the exhaustion etched into his face, she realized this was the only way to protect them both. If he could understand his daughter, he could hear the warnings Yumi was trying to send. "Set your hands on the table," Saad instructed, her voice steadying. He obeyed, his large scarred hands resting on the dark wood. Saad stood opposite him. "The language isn't just in the fingers. It's in the intent. To say her name, to call her daughter. You must show her that she is part of you." Saad lifted her own hands. "Follow me. Take your dominant hand. Tuck your thumb, leaving your forefingers flat. Place them against your brow. Then move them down to meet your other hand, as if you are pulling a thought from your mind into your heart." Juntae attempted the motion. His movements were stiff, his fingers thick and unaccustomed to such precision. He looked frustrated, his brow darkening. "Don't fight the air, Mr. Han," Saad whispered, stepping closer. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hands over his. His skin was hot, the texture of his tattoos slightly raised beneath her fingertips. He went perfectly still, his breath hitching as she guided his hand from his forehead to his palm. "Softly," she murmured. "It's a promise, not a command." As she moved his hand, the air in the room seemed to shift. The wall of ice he kept between himself and the world didn't shatter. It melted, just a fraction. For a fleeting second, the terrifying Mafia boss disappeared, replaced by a man who looked desperately human. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at Saad, his gaze intense and unreadable. "Daughter," he repeated, his voice barely a breath. "She's been waiting a long time to hear that from you," Saad said, slowly withdrawing her hands. The loss of contact felt strangely cold. Juntae didn't pull away. He looked at the spot where her fingers had been, then back at the diagrams on the table. For the first time, he didn't look like a man preparing for war. He looked like a man who had just realized there was something worth saving besides his empire. "You are a dangerous woman, Saad Williams," he said softly, though there was no threat in his tone. "You make me want things that have no place in my world." He turned and left the room as abruptly as he had entered, but the silence he left behind wasn't heavy anymore. It was expectant. Saad stood in the light of the lamp, her hands still tingling, knowing that the private lesson had changed everything. The lion was no longer just a predator. He was a father, and he was finally starting to listen. The following afternoon, the air was unervingly stagnant. The summer heat pressed against the glass of the estate like a physical weight, and the usual hum of the household staff had devolved into a sharp, brittle quiet. Saad was in the greenhouse, her fingers tracing the waxy leaves of a camellia while she waited for Yumi. They had agreed to meet here, away from the digital eyes of the interior cameras, to discuss the final details of the shadows moving within the house. But it wasn't Yumi who stepped through the humid mist of the conservatory. It was Mr. Choi. He didn't have his books or his oily smile. His expression was hollow, his eyes darting toward the heavy steel door he had just locked behind him. In his hand he clutched a tablet displaying a grainy, high-definition playback of the library from the night before. "You think you're so clever," Choi spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "Teaching the boss how to sign. Breaking the wall I spent years building. Do you have any idea how much work it took to make everyone believe she was a vegetable?" Saad stepped back, her heels clicking against the damp stone floor. "You're hurting her for a paycheck, Choi. The Kims won't keep you around once they have what they want. You're a loose end." "I'm a survivor," Choi hissed. He tapped the screen. "I saw your hands beneath the table today, Williams. I know you're telling her things. I don't know the dialect, but I know the intent. You're the prodigy they warned us about. The one who broke the Kim's ledgers." Before Saad could react, the glass walls of the greenhouse shattered. The sound was like a thunderclap. Two men in tactical gear, their necks marked with the unmistakable blue ink of the Kim Syndicate, vaulted through the broken panes. Saad dove behind a stone planter as a silenced round whistled through the air, shattering a ceramic pot inches from her head. The garden, once a place of serenity, became a kill zone. Saad knew she couldn't outrun bullets, but she knew the geography of the estate better than the invaders. She reached for a heavy bag of concentrated liquid fertilizer on a nearby shelf. As the first gunman rounded the corner, she swung it with everything she had, the plastic bursting and coating the floor in a slick chemical slime. The man lost his footing, his weapon skittering across the stone. Saad didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy garden trowel, using it to wedge the handle of the secondary exit door just as the second man reached it. "Yumi!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the glass. Through the jagged hole in the wall she saw her. Yumi was being dragged across the manicured lawn toward a black SUV idling at the perimeter. The girl was fighting with a ferocity Saad hadn't known she possessed, her hands flailing in a desperate, broken sign for help. Saad sprinted toward the opening, ignoring the glass slicing into her palms. "Let her go." She tackled the man holding Yumi, her fingers digging into his eyes with a desperation born of pure terror. For a second she felt Yumi's hand brush hers, a fleeting cold contact. But a heavy blow to the back of Sada's head sent the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of gray and red. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the screech of tires. She forced her eyes open, her vision blurred by blood, only to see the SUV tearing through the gates. The garden was silent again, save for the hiss of a broken irrigation pipe and the distant, frantic shouting of Juntae's security detail finally arriving too late. Choi was gone. The gunmen were gone. And the chair where Yumi had sat every afternoon was empty. Saad collapsed onto the grass, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked down at her hand. In the struggle, Yumi had managed to press something into her palm. A small crumpled piece of paper she had torn from her own sketch pad. With trembling fingers, Saad smoothed it out. It wasn't a word. It was a drawing of a crane, the logo of the old shipping yard on the outskirts of the city. The silence of the estate was suddenly broken by the roar of a high-performance engine. Juntae's car slid to a halt, the doors flying open before the vehicle had even stopped. He sprinted toward her, his face a mask of such raw, unbridled carnage that the air seemed to catch fire around him. He looked at the broken glass, the blood on her face, and the empty lawn. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't have to. The lion had returned to find his cub stolen, and the only person left alive to tell him where to look was the waitress who had promised to be a bridge. "They have her," Saad wheezed, holding out the scrap of paper. "And I know exactly where they're taking her." The interior of Juntae's armored SUV felt like the inside of a furnace. He sat in the back seat, his jaw tight enough to crack bone, while he barked orders into a satellite phone. His words were short, violent bursts of command, orders to mobilize every soldier, to block every exit from the city, and to put a bounty on Choi's head that would ensure the man wouldn't live to see the sunrise. The air around him vibrated with a lethal, unfocused energy. He looked ready to tear the city apart with his bare hands. "Stop," Saad said. Her voice was thin but sharp, cutting through the low growl of his instructions. Juntae turned his head slowly, his eyes dark with a terrifying hollow light. They have my daughter, Saad. Every second we sit here, they are moving her closer to a place I cannot reach. I will burn every Kim warehouse to the ground until I find her. And if you do that, she'll be dead before you hit the second one, Saad countered, ignoring the blood still trickling from the cut on her forehead. She held up the crumpled scrap of paper with the drawing of the crane, then gestured with her hands. You're looking for a girl. I'm looking for a message. Yumi didn't just leave a drawing. She left a trail. Juntae paused, the phone still halfway to his ear. Explain. The way she signed shadows in the garden, she used a specific directional marker, Saad said, her fingers moving in a rapid, ghost-like imitation of Yumi's last gestures. In the dialect I taught her, she wasn't just pointing at her kidnappers. She was using the anchor sign. It's a linguistic coordinate we practice for emergencies. The crane on this paper isn't the logo for the shipping yard. It's a reference to a specific pier where the cranes are rusted into a fixed position. She leaned over the center console, pointing to a digital map on the car's dashboard. There. Pier 42. The old grain silos. It's the only place in the harbor that matches the sign she gave me. If you send your army in with sirens and gunfire, they'll kill her as a liability. But if we go in the way she's expecting, quietly, we have a chance. Juntae stared at the map, then at Saad. He saw the logic in her eyes, the cold, brilliant clarity of a woman who saw the world as a series of codes to be cracked. The raw, volcanic rage in his chest began to refine itself into something even more dangerous. A focused, surgical intent. Cancel the sweep, Juntae said into the phone, his voice dropping to a deathly calm. Tell the teams to hold the perimeter at the harbor. No sirens. No lights. If a single shot is fired before I am inside, I'll have their heads. He looked at Saad as the car lurched forward, weaving through the late-night traffic of Seoul at a terrifying speed. You realize that if you're wrong, we're walking into a slaughterhouse. I'm not wrong, Saad said, her hands coming to rest in her lap, steady and still. I've spent my life being silenced by men who think they are more powerful than me. Yumi is doing the same thing. She is speaking through the only channel they can't monitor because they don't think it exists. She's counting on the fact that I'm the only one who can hear her. As they neared the industrial district, the glittering lights of the skyscrapers gave way to the skeletal remains of the old shipping yards. The salt-heavy air of the Han River filled the cabin. Juntae reached into the side pocket of the door and pulled out a sleek, suppressed handgun, checking the chamber with a practiced metallic click. He offered a smaller, lightweight pistol to Saad. She looked at the weapon, then back at him. I told you. I'm not a bodyguard. And I told you I have plenty of those, Juntae said, his eyes softening just a fraction, the man from the library appearing for a split second behind the Mafia boss. But tonight you're the lead. I'm just the muscle. Take it. Saad took the weapon. It was cold and heavy, a physical weight that anchored her to the reality of the night. They stepped out of the car into the shadows of a massive rusted silo. Ahead, the silhouette of Pier 42 loomed against the water, silent and menacing. There were no guards visible, no lights in the windows. To anyone else, the warehouse looked abandoned. But Saad saw the small rhythmic blink of a flashlight from a high window, 3 short bursts, a pause, then 3 more. I am here, the light was saying in the code they had shared over tea. Saad felt a surge of hope that tasted like fire. She's inside, she whispered. And she's waiting for us. The warehouse smelled of stagnant river water and industrial grease. It was a cavernous space of rusted iron and deep shadows, illuminated only by the flickering fluorescent hum of a central elevated office, a glass-walled room that hung over the floor like a watchtower. Inside that transparent cage, Saad could see Yumi. The girl was bound to a chair, her silver hair disheveled, but her eyes were wide and alert, fixed on the darkness below. Stay in the light, Juntae whispered from the shadows of a massive shipping container. His voice was a low vibration, the sound of a predator coiled to strike. If I lose sight of you, I'm coming in, regardless of the cost. If you come in now, they use her as a shield, Saad replied, her voice barely a breath. Trust the language, Juntae. Trust her. Saad stepped out from the darkness, her hands raised and empty. She walked into the center of the warehouse floor, the lone spotlight of the office above catching the white of her server's blouse, the same uniform she had worn when this all began. In the glass room, Choi appeared. He looked haggard, his spectacles gone, a jagged cut across his cheek. He pressed a button on a console, and his voice boomed through the warehouse speakers, distorted and tinny. "Where is he?" Choi demanded, his eyes darting frantically toward the shadows. "Where is the lion? I told the Kims you'd bring him." "He's not coming for a traitor like you," Saad shouted back, her voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. She kept her eyes locked on Yumi. The girl had seen her. A flicker of hope ignited in Yumi's gaze, but she remained perfectly still. Saad began to move her hands. To Choi it looked like the frantic, meaningless gestures of a woman in distress, a desperate attempt to comfort a captive. But to Yumi, the movements were a precise set of tactical coordinates. "Listen to me," Saad signed, her fingers sharp and rhythmic. "The red box. Behind your left shoulder. The emergency override. Can you reach it?" Yumi didn't nod, she couldn't. But her eyes shifted a fraction of an inch toward the wall. "When the light turns green," Saad signed, "pull the lever. It will trigger the halon gas and the sirens. The room will go dark. When it does, drop to the floor. The lion is at the door." Choi was pacing the glass room, his hand hovering over a handgun on the desk. "You're stalling. You think these hand signals mean anything now? She's a bargaining chip, Williams. A piece of meat." Saad ignored him, her hands moving faster, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Now, Yumi. Give us the shadow." Yumi lunged. With a strength born of years of suppressed rage, she threw her weight backward, the chair tipping and slamming against the wall. Her bound hands caught the edge of the fire suppression lever. A deafening, soul-shaking siren ripped through the silence of the warehouse. High-pressure halon gas hissed into the glass room in a thick white cloud, obscuring everything in an instant. The overhead lights killed over to a strobing emergency red. "Now!" Saad screamed. The heavy steel doors of the warehouse didn't just open. They disintegrated. Juntae moved like a shadow given lethal form. He didn't use the gun at first. He was a whirlwind of black silk and silver ink, moving through the Kim sentries who emerged from the shipping containers. The sound of bones snapping and the muffled thuds of suppressed gunfire filled the air. Saad sprinted toward the metal stairs leading to the glass office. She reached the top just as Choi, blinded by the gas and the strobe lights, fumbled for the door handle. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it with a guttural cry, the heavy metal canister connecting with Choi's temple. He crumpled without a sound. Saad burst into the room, falling to her knees beside Yumi. The air was thick with gas, making her eyes sting and her lungs burn. She fumbled with the zip ties on Yumi's wrists, her fingers slick with sweat. "I've got you," Saad whispered, though she knew the girl couldn't hear. "I've got you." A heavy hand landed on Sada's shoulder, and for a terrifying second, she prepared to fight. But the scent was familiar, sandalwood and cold rain. Juntae stood over them, his suit torn, his knuckles split and bleeding. He didn't look at the fallen traitor or the chaos below. He looked at his daughter. He knelt in the white mist and, for the first time, used the sign Saad had taught him. He touched his brow, then his heart, his movements slow and filled with a profound, aching reverence. "Daughter," he signed. Yumi let out a ragged, silent sob and threw herself into his arms. Juntae gathered her up, his face buried in her silver hair, his eyes closing as he held the only thing in the world that mattered more than his crown. Saad stood back, her hands trembling as she watched them. She had been the bridge. She had crossed into the fire to bring them back to each other. And as the sirens wailed and the smoke cleared, she realized that the silence she had lived in for so long was finally beautifully broken. The seasons had turned, and the biting chill of the Seoul winter had softened into the gentle, fragrant promise of spring. The restaurant was the same crystal chandeliers, the same hushed atmosphere of exorbitant wealth, the same marble floors that had once felt like a stage for Sada's invisibility. But as the double mahogany doors swung open, The air didn't drop in temperature. This time the silence that followed wasn't born of terror, but of profound, unyielding respect. Saad walked through the center of the room, the hem of her emerald silk dress whispering against the floor. There was no apron, no notepad, and no downward cast to her gaze. Her hair, once pulled back in a tight, defensive knot, now flowed in soft waves, and her expression held the quiet, focused authority of a woman who no longer had to hide her mind to save her life. Beside her, Han Juntae moved with a different kind of stride. The predatory edge remained, but the cold, assessing intensity in his eyes had been replaced by a grounded, watchful peace. Behind them walked Yumi, her silver hair styled elegantly, her face glowing with the vibrancy that had been buried for years. They reached the same corner table where the lion had once sat alone, demanding a name. The maitre d', the same man who had once treated Saad like a piece of furniture, bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the tablecloth. "Welcome back, Director Williams," he murmured. "Mr. Han. Lady Yumi." As they sat, the service began, but it was a different dance. The staff moved with a new instruction. When the waiter approached, he didn't speak. He waited. Juntae looked across the table at Saad, a slow, genuine smile touching his lips, a look that would have terrified his enemies but brought a warm, steady hum to Saad's chest. He didn't reach for a menu. Instead, he lifted his hands. His movements were no longer stiff or uncertain. They were fluid, etched with the practice of a man who had spent every night for 6 months learning to listen with his soul. "The garden at the estate is blooming," Juntae signed, his hands moving with a rhythmic grace. "Yumi wants to know if you will help her plant the new camellias this weekend." Saad watched him, a lump forming in her throat. The man who had once ruled through fear was now communicating through vulnerability. She turned to Yumi, whose fingers were already dancing in the light of the candles. "Only if we use the white ones," Yumi signed, her laughter visible in the bright crinkle of her eyes. "The red ones remind me too much of the old tutor's face when Saad hit him with the fire extinguisher." Saad let out a soft, melodic laugh that carried across the quiet dining room. She lifted her own hands, joining the conversation that was happening in the beautiful, vibrant air between them. "White camellias it is. And we should invite your father, though he is much better at breaking things than planting them." Juntae's chest rumbled with a silent laugh as he signed a mock-offended protest. Around them, the other diners looked on in stunned fascination. The most powerful man in the city wasn't issuing orders. He was participating in a silent symphony. The syndicate had been purged. The traitors were gone, and the Kims had retreated into the shadows, terrified of the woman who had dismantled their digital empire, and the man who protected her with the ferocity of a god. Saad was no longer a waitress, and she was no longer a ghost. She was the director of the Han Foundation, the architect of a new school for the deaf, and the bridge that had turned a house of stone into a home of light. As the first course arrived, Saad felt a hand rest gently over hers on the table. She didn't flinch. She looked at Juntae, seeing the man beneath the tattoos, the man she had taught to hear his own daughter. He didn't pull away. In this room where she had once been invisible, Saad Williams was finally seen. They were no longer 3 separate people: a boss, a waitress, and a daughter. They were a family, built on a language that required no voice, only a heart that was willing to listen. The silence of the restaurant was no longer a cage. It was a canvas, and together they were painting a masterpiece. If this story made you feel something, like the video and subscribe for more.